economic, social, cultural level, some degree of governmental level, but not through diplomatic means. And then
we have 10 seconds, Michael.
Then the sale of arms. So we have this kind of balance now that the United States has tried to keep in its relations with Taiwan, which is now fraying badly.
Well, this is something we will continue to cover. Michael Swain, director of the Quincy Institute's East Asia program, longtime U.S.-China relations analyst. And that does it for our broadcast. Democracy Now! Is produced with Renee Feltz, Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Messiah Rhodes, Nermeen Sheikh, Maria Tarasena, Tammy Warnoff, Camille Baker, Sharina Nadura, Sam Malkoff, Tay Maria Studio, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Honey Masood, Mary Conlon, Carlos Davila. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Stay safe.
All right, she got them all in there. It's 1 minute after 1 o'clock here in these Twin Cities of ours. You're listening to Fresh Air Community Radio, 90.3 FM, HD, Minneapolis, streaming all over the world at kfai.org. 66 degrees and partly sunny out there, which is always better than partly cloudy. That's what I say. Time is now, as I said, 1 minute after 1, which means that we are 1 minute behind connecting with conversations with Al McFarlane. Mr. Al McFarlane, are you there?
I'm here. How you doing, Mason?
Great. Good to see you. Good to hear you. We're streaming live on the internet, so people truly can see you and they can truly hear you. Tell them where.
Well, right here in Minneapolis, streaming from my dining room table. As a matter of fact, that's my impromptu COVID-19 studio, but it works well for me. I love the technology. I love the innovation at KFAI that allows producers and programmers like me to operate from anywhere, from everywhere, bringing people together anywhere and everywhere as well. So Mason, thank you so much for what you do. Thanks to the station and thanks to our marvelous listeners and now our phenomenal viewers. I remind people that as well as the live broadcast on KFAI, we're streaming to kfai.org. We're also streaming to Facebook, the Insight Facebook page, the Al McFarlane Facebook page. We're also streaming to Black Press USA. I belong to a network of Black newspapers that consists of over 200 media companies and that has a reach of around 20 to 30 million people a week. And so we're part of that network, that reach. It's phenomenal. And we're glad to be able to do that. We think that melding, blending, innovating technology is the way of the future. And I'm glad to be part of a cutting edge organization like KFAI that brings all these formats and opportunities together. Today, we're going to be talking with State Senator Bobby Joe Champion. He's going to be joining us momentarily, but until he does, Mason, I wanted to take a minute to wrap with you just about how you feel and how the station is feeling about the community coming up on the anniversary of the George Floyd murder. I'm sort of listening, ear to the ground, and watching and talking and reaching out to people to ask them what they think, what they feel, and do they feel that our community has or is approaching a a get over it attitude, or is there a sense that we had crossed a threshold that leads us to transformational futures? So that's kind of the question I have. What do you think, Mason?
I certainly hope it's not the former, the way that you phrased it that way. And it could be that just we are in our own bubble here, but I know our feelings at the station and the feelings in our community are definitely that there is a brighter future ahead, but it is not without struggle. And, there's certainly no sort of get over it attitude here. We are not over it. It was the it was the catalyst for major change here across the world that frankly hasn't moved fast enough, but at least there are a lot more people aware, even within the organization here, of what's really been going on in communities outside of, just their own front yard.
Mm-hmm. And the question for me, Mason, is how substantial or substantive the change might be. Is it genuinely, authentically transformational? Because at one level, we've been here before. Mm-hmm. The country has been to the brink of, in a sense, self-immolation almost, or self-annihilation, or massive internal despair for a variety of reasons, but around the question of race and around the question of class and police brutality and inequality, all those things. And so what seemed very different about this George Floyd incident is the two things: the sharing, the telling of that story to the whole world, so nobody could not be affected by it, and therefore the ability for the spirit of truth and of anger to emerge and connect people, even those who had been on the sideline. The question becomes, though, do people and can we create modalities and expectations that keep people engaged? I hope we can.
I agree with you. I hope that we can. And I know in listening to your show and listening to this station every week, I'm hearing conversations, I'm hearing plans, I'm hearing thoughts that point towards that. And we're being a little more reverent here as we come to the second anniversary. And I think it's important to remember that it's the second anniversary. It is 2 years. And this is 2 years after hundreds of years of struggle and different milestones in that. And that if we do look and think that we have not come that far, like we have come very far in 2 years. And just the changing climate that you mentioned, the way the technology here has changed that. When we've looked at things, if you want to even go back 30 years ago and say Rodney King, where you see that kind of thing on video, that wasn't immediate. George Floyd was immediate. That was this thing that happened on our streets, that if that young woman had not recorded that would have, just been, we all read the police report. That was immediate, within 48 hours around the world, not just in the city, but around the world. That was a shockwave.
Mason, thanks, my friend. Let me connect with my guest of the hour, the Honorable Bobby Joe Champion, Senator representing District 59 in North Minneapolis. Senator Champion, good afternoon, my brother. How you doing, man?
Well, you know what? I am doing well now that I got on, okay, because I was having a couple challenges, but it wasn't your fault. But I'm excited that the sun is shining in the great state of Minnesota, and that's always a good day.
Well, it's always good to see you. And I was talking to Mason, who's my producer at the station, about the importance of observing George Floyd. So I want to begin with that. And I want to ask you, Bobby Joe Champion, I know that the main purpose of today is to give an update, a debriefing on the legislative session that has come to an end, that may be recalled back into session. I want to get a sense of all the things that have been delivered and what things are still on the table, still need work, and what our community can expect. I want you to kind of walk through that as the main topic of the program. But I think that we would be remiss if we didn't take all the time we need to be reflective about our society, our culture, and where we are as a consequence of being ground zero for the display of police brutality, of white supremacy in action, for the display of callous disregard of a human being, and for callous abuse of power. So, Senator Champion, if you would take a minute and just, what are your thoughts as you move towards the next couple of days in reviewing, reflecting on, and thinking about what we can and should do to be responsive and responsible regarding what happened here in South Minneapolis 2 years ago, the murder of George Floyd?
Well, let me start by saying how challenged I was over a year ago when we think in terms of the murder of George Floyd. I often say, and without being disrespectful, that I often say that when something bad happens, it also creates another opportunity for us to do a number of different things. One is, I think that George Floyd's death and that whole incident really reflects, what systemically happens to, people of color in our wonderful country, especially when we think in terms of the state of Minnesota, and particularly when we think in terms of Black males. I think the police officer really represents a system that hasn't always been fair or thoughtful or see the humanity in us. And I also think that the others who sat idly by sat quietly, where silence can sometimes mean agreement. When no one intervened, no one, thought it was important enough to do anything about the situation that was happening. Since then, we see an opportunity not just so narrowly with the police, because we've been, talking about that, and I think we do have to deal with that. But I think we have to broaden the discussion and continue to demand changes in other parts of our society. Whether you think in terms of the medical profession, and you think about how Black women and just the maternal health care of Black women is subpar, when you think in terms of our educational system and the disparities that we see and feel, where when young people are not getting the support that they need or the teaching and education that they need in order to be a threshold to improving their quality of life, whether we look at higher ed and higher education and people fulfilling their dreams and being able to think beyond just a moment, but say, what is that thing or that person that I want to be, whether that's VOTEC or a 2-year institution or 4-year. What does that mean about housing when we think in terms of a place for a person to live? What about this notion of chemical dependency? We know that our communities are ravaged with individuals who are chemically dependent. And how are we putting forth the resources for a place like Turning Point and other places in order to make sure that people have a place to go if they're wrestling with this chronic disease that's called addiction? What are we doing about those things? What are we doing sometimes about the violence in our own community that sometimes we're so despondent and treated so badly that we sometimes inflict that pain that we feel upon each other? How are we dealing with that in real time? And how do we make sure that we have preventative healthcare options in order to make sure that I can go to the doctor and I can do preventative care and I can have dental care? Because guess what? If you have a job, but you don't have your health, then that too is a problem. And what about jobs and opportunity? How do we make sure that people are making a livable wage and are not just constantly living in poverty? So these are things that I think that we have to think about, and we must use this opportunity to open up and really lift up those other issues that we need to have addressed, because we are being challenged on every end. So the George Floyd's life was important. He is gone far too soon, but we can use it as a catalyst to, one, respect him and get other people to see not only his humanity but ours as well, because George Floyd does have children. How do we make sure those children live in a society that they too would be proud of, and they can say, my father's life was a catalyst for change that I now enjoy, right? And so I think we should always reflect upon that, but also use it as an opportunity to look back and say, but what are we doing in order to make sure that not only that situation doesn't happen again on the streets of Minneapolis, but how do we make sure that one's life is not being snuffed out in our schools, in colleges, and other places? So I think it's important to have those discussions too, because we will get fixated on police and community's relationship with police, which is important. I'm not suggesting, so I don't want anyone writing me saying that I didn't think that was important. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying we must elevate the conversation, because if we don't, then we'll let them allow us to just be in a box, and therefore all these other things will still be left undealt with.
I'm Al McFarlane. This is Conversations with Al McFarlane. My guest is Minnesota State Senator Bobby Joe Champion, represents District 59, which includes a part of downtown Minneapolis and all of North Minneapolis. Bobby Joe Champion, thank you for being with us. We're talking to start with about the George Floyd memory. And so how should you've described, Senator Champion, the idea that we should be expansive, broader, in our memory and reflection, our contemplation on sort of trying to find meaning out of this senseless loss of life. But that loss of life is occurring all the time, all around us, and other disadvantages exist that ought to be and can be addressed. And I hear you saying that we should use this experience as a motivator and as a call to be courageous in addressing the other things that, in a sense, were reflections of the same dysfunction out of which the murder of George Floyd occurred. That dysfunction, from my point of view, this is Al McFarlane, is the acceptance, the lack of questioning of the structures, institutional policies and practices that are white supremacist in their character and in their intent. And by that I mean structures, systems, processes created to benefit white people, not just in the country, but in Minnesota as well, and whose operating agenda and philosophy was that white benefit derives in part from marginalizing and defeating, blocking progress from people of color in general, Black people in particular. And so how do we not act like something didn't happen, but with an intentionality and armed by the knowledge and awareness of what happened, not as a singular event, but as a systemic activity? How do we take that as fuel into creating awareness and change? What do you think?
Really big question, Al. I guess I shouldn't expect anything less from you, which I don't, because you asked me these really big questions that I think take some time to decipher, because I think it must be answered on the level of complexity that it presents, right? Like, for an example, one of the things that I often say is that we have to discuss and look back on the George Floyd issue and include that in our thinking, but not be limited to it. Mm-hmm. So attorneys, we often use language that says includes, but not limited to, so that we're clear that we're not only talking about the matter at hand, but we also see some other things that is important for it. And to answer that question, I'll go one step further and try to use an analogy, and I hope that it works, right? We just recently, this month, I think it was the 19th, celebrated Malcolm X's birthday, right? And I believe it was Malcolm X's birthday. And I remember there been a lot of discussion about what led to the death of Malcolm X, and who did it and who didn't do it and who didn't. And I heard someone who was with the Nation use these words. They said, why are we constantly fixated on who killed Malcolm, as opposed to trying to understand the environment that was created so that Malcolm could be killed? Right? Yeah. So when we think about it, yes, we see who killed George Floyd, mm-hmm. But what was the environment created that a George Floyd and others could be killed, right? And so I often say that there's physical death and then there's spiritual death, right? When you kill someone's human spirit. And I think we miss that sometimes, because we do look at the physical, and that's important, because when death happens, there's finality to it. But I hope that we would expand it, because the things that we have to do, even in the state of Minnesota, is say, hey, we have the largest disparities here in the great state of Minnesota, that every single day, that what separates families every single day, allows individuals who are wrestling with chemical dependency not to get the treatment or the support they need. Folks who have mental health issues that we have not made the proper investments around, because those things are a byproduct sometimes of poverty. Poverty is the common denominator that we fight with every single day. So when we think in terms of, to your question, when we think in terms of these investments, let's take housing for an example. We often hear many people talk about housing and housing being a right, and I agree with all that. I fight for housing every single day. But guess what? The majority of folks who are in housing, and when you think in terms of those who benefit from this housing crisis, whether it's nonprofits and others, are not the people that look like me or you. And when you think in terms of affordable housing, they usually want it concentrated in one particular community. Mm-hmm. Because then folks say that they don't want it in their community because it decreases their home ownership values. we have to demand not only affordable housing, but for our contractors and women and veterans to be a part of those who are in the system itself, those who help build the infrastructure, those who do the operationalization of it, and for us to think about how we supporting minority-led organizations. Because do you not know there's a number of, and we appreciate all of our allies, but do you not know that there's a number of organizations where more money go to majority-led organizations than minority-owned organizations that do the same work?
Mm-hmm.
So I think when we ask, we can't just be the objects of commerce. We have to also say, wait a minute, we have to be a part of planning and being strategic around what we need in our communities in order to move from point A to point B, because we have far too many individuals making that decision for us without talking to us. And so I think if you're talking about our flight and you're talking about George Floyd, how about the fact that there was $30 million, I think it was, that was put into the campaign of Black Lives Matter, which we know that Black Lives Matter, but that money's not placed with our organizations.
Mm-hmm.
It's another majority-led organization that's holding the money. And that majority-led organization is getting the administrative numbers, getting the interest on the money, all the other things that we know that's important to bringing our communities out of poverty and not allowing us, and for us to take our rightful place at the table. Because there's a well-known saying that says, if you're not at the table, then you're on the menu, right? And so I just think that we have to think about every system, every industry. How do we make sure that we are involved, and how do we make sure that we are not being led off by someone just talking about, let's say, for legalization of marijuana, where I believe that marijuana should be legalized, but how do we also make sure that when it comes to licensing and growing and all the other things, where there's a revolution, that we participate in that? Because you know what they're talking to us about? Decriminalization, but they won't talk to us about the economic realities of it. And so I think we have to have a broader discussion about these things and not just let them point us in the direction of the social aspects of things, but why can't we deal with the social and the economic realities of every situation in which we find ourselves?
Well, Senator Champion, great analysis, and it just reminds me of what you've heard me say a number of times. I call it an Al McFarlane-ism. They get the money, we get the misery.
Hey, listen,
yeah,
absolutely. And Al, guess what? Your mentors and mentees like me and others, that message does not fall, on to the ground without us listening, hearing it, and understanding what it is that you have been saying. Absolutely.
I want to share just a paragraph of a book that I'm reading now. I've been reading a whole series of books by this author. His name is Ikwe Arma. He's a Ghanaian, and he's living in Senegal right now. This book is called The Resolutionaries. And what's important about it is that it's published by a cooperative in Senegal called Per Ankh Publishing. Per Ankh is Egyptian language. Per means house of, and Ankh of life, House of Life Publishing. And these African journalists have created a system of friends who collaborate to create knowledge, innovation, and in their particular field, they're all writers, publishers, etc. But in this book, as you were speaking, I came across, it reminded me of an underline that I'd done. I'm going to read that quickly, a paragraph that says, let's stop here a moment to see the connection between tying memory to power. And that's important because I think you and I are both saying we can't forget. We have to really be aware of all that has gone before. And the question is, where do we draw the timelines that we operate from? But this goes on to say it's normal and logical for those who draw their power from our powerlessness to wish to erase our memory. Persons whose welfare depend on the exploitation of the resources and labor of the enslaved dream of nothing better than the conservation of their power and the continuation of our powerlessness.
Mm-hmm.
Big statement, you know, and
Absolutely.
it's along the lines of what you're talking about. So Senator Champion, you are working, as I see it, to ensure that, and you've said this, Black-led organizations are visible, perceived as viable, as credible, supported towards increased viability and capability, positioned to break through the institutional stereotypes that create an easy shorthand to let white people be dismissive of Black institutions, Black culture, Black leadership, Black genius, and Black solution making. And I hear you and see you and your colleagues, enlightened members of your class, and those that follow you that you lead, trying to say, you know, this can't go the way it's been going, that we have to create a new narrative about what power is and our ability to define our relationship to us in ways that suit our community and that reflect our humanity, our dignity, and our rights as citizens of the state of Minnesota and of this country. And therefore, you are intentionally motivating development of solution makers and businesses in our community. I had a picture of you recently at a groundbreaking of the housing on West Broadway, Tim Baylor,
Yes.
Satori Village. And what's unique about that particular housing, as I see it, Senator Champion, is that it's market rate housing. And that's unusual for North Minneapolis, because over the past several years, most of the units have been they call affordable housing, which is needed. But the question is policies that concentrate poverty in one neighborhood, and should we have more? And so I see you supporting that. You can speak to that if you would.
Absolutely. Let me tell you, if we are going to have real change, we have to have economic liberation. And economic liberation is not at the expense of all the other things that we need to do as well. It is possible for us to walk and chew gum at the same time. And so there are ways in order to deal with the disparities that we need to, but also put our brain power and our community's intellectual capacity in its rightful place, along with giving them the resources that they need. See, the interesting thing is that they don't give us the resources, but then they say you're not doing anything to do it yourself. Well, wait a minute. There's been an intentional disinvestment of our communities, and this has been happening for quite some time. It just didn't happen today.
Mhm.
And what I often say to our allies around the issue of housing is that we cannot put all the affordable housing and concentrate it in one place. If you say you really care about affordable housing, then what about it being next to you? Why does it just have to be next to me in order to fulfill the notion of being affordable? And I'll give you a good example. Where Willard is right now, Willard, the old Willard school,
Mhm.
there was a group that came in from the outside that was being supported by the city and the county to put a shelter over there. Now, I'm not against shelters. Everybody knows that I'm not against shelter. I fight for resources for shelters. I fight for everything, right? Because I believe that people should be stable and they have to have shelter, affordable housing, market rate, the whole deal, home ownership, right? But the group came without engaging our community.
Mhm.
They were just going to put it over there. But Al, here was the point. They don't do that anywhere else.
Right.
They have a community engagement strategy. They go out and talk to people. They get a feel from them as to what you think will feel. When I step and said, hey, you're not going to do that without talking to our community. Guess what they said to me? Oh, you want your community to know that you're the one who is blocking, shelter and we want to do a women's shelter. So Black women need this shelter and you don't want it to be there. I said, that's not the point.
Mm-hmm.
You go through the paces with us the way you go through the paces anywhere else.
Mm-hmm.
And why do you have to have it here? You can put it someplace else, make sure that it's on a bus line, make sure they have an opportunity to come back to the community. And guess what? Allow us to be engaged. But this is what happens. If we have allies who want to do things based on their definition and their strategy, and they don't see that when they do it that way, then you're dismissing us as well, because then you are telling us that we don't have the ability to think for ourselves, and that you don't have to ask us a question, where you wouldn't do that anyplace else. And when I even asked the question about when these nonprofits do affordable housing, and they rebuild these houses and stuff like that from a grant, and then they have all this money involved and gap financing and so on and so forth, I said, why not place the value at the amount of money that you got to rebuild it? You don't have to do it at its appraised value. You could actually renovate it. Its value is based on what you put back in. And if some family or Black family gets in there for ownership, we know, which is a threshold to improving your quality of life or building wealth, guess what? Now they have equity in the house. But you know what they're doing? They're taking grand dollars, rebuilding it, then jacking the price up to the appraised value. Then they're getting all these other housing subsidies. And guess what? We don't end up getting the benefit. And then we're upside down in some homes when we think about it. So I say that our allies should be equally as supportive of a broad notion around empowerment, because if they really care about us, then they wouldn't fight these things that I'm talking about. They would join and say, hey, I see how the system does things to you. I don't want that to be the order of the day. I want to make sure that your kids have all the technology that they need in school, because you know what the pandemic exposed? That our urban schools, especially in Minneapolis, not necessarily St. Paul and some others, don't have access to the internet. So if you're going to do it, this is where I could join with the folks in rural Minnesota, say, hey, you're upset about broadband because you don't even have the fiber optics up there, but we're upset because we got it down the street and we still can't have access to it. So it's equivalent to not having it. So how do we make sure that both of those things happen, where our folks in rural Minnesota have the option, but we also have the right to access? We have to demand these things around equity and access and power. And those who are our allies, they should be understanding of it, but they also have to know that they have to share power, because what happens is that they sometimes start feeling a certain way without telling us, and then they couch it in something else as opposed to their fear or their reluctance, because they've enjoyed white privilege up to this particular point too.
Well, Senator Champion, what I think is that somewhere in the back of their mind or the front of their hearts, there's a sense that they have a duty, an obligation to defend the fortress from the infidels. And guess what? We are the infidels in their mind. And so there is an unspoken practice up and down the culture. I mean, it shows up when you go into a grocery store, you go into Costco or Sam's Club, and you're doing a return. You go into Target, and you're doing a return, and you have all your documentation, but then somebody feels like you're returning something is suspect. And the five white people in front of you were able to do their exchanges with a smile and pleasantries, right? People just breaking their back to be helpful, demonstrating the adage, the customer is always right, and not even questioning the customer, but then let you or me, a Black person, show up with the same set of circumstances as the five people in the front, and there's an automatic antenna that makes them question whether we are legitimate and whether we should bring things back, or why are we bringing things back? Are we gaming the system? And so people get tired of hearing that, but you can't get tired of hearing it when you read the stories of incidents happening like that here at US Bank and at Wells Fargo, under pressure right now nationally for discrimination in both hiring and promoting internally, and also what amounts to redlining in certain markets And that is, again, being looked at by lawsuits emanating from our community. So me bringing this up is not something that I'm making up or inventing. It's the truth of what's going on, and what they've been able to do and they seek to do is continually deny and to portray incidents that are discovered as one of, when they are not, when they are systemic. They wanted to portray, and the George Floyd, Black people have been saying white folks is killing us forever.
Right.
And not making it up, but white people wanted to act like it was a figment of our imagination. And if it was one white person that acted out and killed one of us, it was an aberration, out of character, but didn't reflect the nature, the culture, the environment, as you mentioned, of hostility that we know we live in. And again, George Floyd's meaning, from my point of view, and I think you're saying this too, is it calls attention. COVID-19 calls attention to this breadth of systemic marginalization and denial and attempt that's almost desperate to maintain and keep white supremacy, white privilege, white advantage, unearned advantage by excluding, illegally excluding Black people and people of color from their rights that they should have as citizens. That's what I think. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And you reminded me of a couple of things. First of all, when you think in terms of Wells Fargo and U.S. Bank and some of the practices that go on in those spaces and places, as well as other places, I'm not even just only highlighting them. There are incidents that we could point to. I'll give you one of my own experience with Wells Fargo, where I've been banking and was banking with Wells Fargo for over 25 years. Mm-hmm. I got a business account there, savings accounts, all sorts of other things. I go in there with a check that has my name on it and my client's name on it because I'm a lawyer. He signed it. I signed it. I'm going to place the check in my IOTA account, which is my lawyer trust account. I'm not trying to get in cash. I'm not trying to get anything. Do you not know that Wells Fargo told me I need to have my client standing there so they can verify that he signed it? Okay, that is the experience of Wells Fargo. Mm-hmm. And they tried to act like it was okay, but other people go other places. And when I ask other white attorneys, hey, when you place some money in your trust account that you got from the insurance company, got your name and the client's name on it, do you got to have your client there? They said, absolutely not, I don't. They said, how can we do business if we have to always deposit a check and have the client standing there?
That's you can't do business that way.
So that's what we're talking about. And also think about this. Remember in Birmingham, I believe it was in Birmingham, Alabama, when the adults have gone out and they were protesting and they got arrested. It was the children who then went out in order to protest. The children's march was broadcast on television. Mm-hmm. And that's when they saw them being fire hosed and those things happening to children. It was that thing.
The dogs, yep.
The dogs and everything that pricked the consciousness of America. And just like Birmingham and George Floyd, we have to do something in order to say that is unconscionable. Mm-hmm. That should never happen. Mm-hmm. Not in Minnesota, New York, New Jersey, no matter where it is. Chicago, that shouldn't happen. And we then cast the light on the entire system. And I'll tell you this, did you get a chance to go see Angela Davis when she was at the University of Minnesota at the Northwood Auditorium?
I did not.
Well, let me tell you one thing that she said that hits this right on. Someone said, the moderator asked her a question, and I may do her injustice, but the moderator says, well, Angela, Miss Davis, don't you want to see, other women heading up these big corporations and all these other things? She says, yeah, but not if they're only there to manage the same a crazy corporation or racist corporation that has been a problem up to this day. Mm-hmm. We want her and anyone else to be there to make change. We don't want them just to manage what's already there.
Right.
And I was like, whoa.
Yeah.
Because that's true. If we get Black folks in corporate jobs and women in corporate jobs, and all they're doing is managing the same practices,
Yep.
then how have we gained anything? I hope that they go and they say, not only am I going to be a great manager, a great a CEO or chief executive officer, but I'm going to make the necessary changes as the visionary that would be better for this business. Because it's possible for us to be great community leaders and social partners and still make a profit, right? And so that's possible. I don't think that's impossible, but I think that we have to be very intentional, which includes our allies and our communities, to lift up and expand the conversation and demand the change that we need, even in philanthropic communities. Because remember, philanthropic communities and nonprofits are important. We also talk about business and business and business. That's important. But guess what? We have a lot of nonprofits who are doing great work. But do you not know they're always chasing the philanthropic dollar, and there are other people that don't look like us on those boards who make the decisions as to what their values are going to be this year, what's going to be their work this year, and that work is not informed by us. And then guess what ends up happening? They end up doing it. Our nonprofits chase the money, but we never ever see the change that we should, because guess what? It was never designed that way, because you were not at the table to say what we need as a community in order to be able to go forward. So I just think that we got to have allies and others to welcome us at the table, be a part of us being at the table, help us not only demand that table, but maybe we have to also put together our own table, right? That's important too, to put together our own table too.
Got it. I'm Al McFarlane. This is Conversations with Al McFarlane, talking with State Senator Bobby Joe Champion, represents District 59 in North Minneapolis. Great conversation. You know, Bobby reminded me, in talking about foundations, I reflected back on the, I call it the big sham that Northwest Area Foundation perpetrated against North Minneapolis. And let me tell you my summary of that experience. Remember, this guy named Frank, I can't remember his last name, showed up saying that he had $10 million from Northwest Area Foundation, and they wanted to bring that $10 million to eradicate poverty in North Minneapolis. And he called for a number of meetings and discussions and working circles. And it went on for like 24 months or something like that. And it was all said and done. He got another job somewhere else. Northwest Area Foundation did something else. And 24 months of energy, from my point of view, wasted. Our community, again, deceived by a practice of deception, of dangling a carrot and expecting people to run for it. And if it didn't materialize as promised, the perpetrators can say, oh, well, and walk away. And I wonder if that's what we're going to see right now, because after the murder of George Floyd, compounding the crisis in the country and in the world that COVID-19 represented, a number of companies in Minnesota and elsewhere stepped forward saying, we're going to commit to transformative change. I'm a skeptic. My job is to be a skeptic. I'm a reporter. I'm skeptical. I'm hopeful that transformative change can occur. But what are you seeing? Because what I'm seeing is layers and layers of committees and bureaucracies that have these great conversations. But the bottom line has to be some way of measuring how much money, how much access and power actually flowed to solution makers and solution making in and from within the aggrieved, affected community, the Black community, Latino community, etc. What do you think?
Well, I think this. One is, I'm hopeful as well. I am an eternal optimist, but up to this particular point, I'm not convinced yet. I am going to wait with bated breath, with a hopeful heart that something happens. The problem is this: with the exception of Shonda Smith Baker,
Mm-hmm.
who's at a foundation, who is brilliant and wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Where are the others when it comes to who's at the table in order to make decisions around the RFPs, the target of the work, how deep you want to go? Because the majority of foundations in the philanthropic community are people who are not in our communities. And they're not having real honest dialogue in our communities, or any dialogue they're having are only with people they like.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And people they like may not be the individuals you need to talk to, right? And therefore it's that level of comfort that they bring into the equation of just their allies, and they want to be able to say it before it not really to produce anything, but they then want to be able to look at the report and say, look at the great work that we've done, and it's not, and they don't measure it. They can say that they gave it to someone that looks like me and you. Here's the other reason why I think that this is a problem, and you can help me and remind me of the right title. Remember when Hennepin County did the Black Men's Project? What was it called? Was it the Black Men's Project with Gary?
I remember. I don't remember the name of it, but I remember the project. Yeah.
And remember they came and said how they were going to do all this with black men, but then the county board said, but we're not willing to spend any real money on it, and it's not going to be any new money. Well, wait a minute. What are we doing? And even though it was a noble thing that Gary Cunningham did, but it was a system that wasn't going to allow for the real change to occur because it had to happen on their terms. And I'm just concerned because now we're supposed to get some additional resources for West Broadway. I know the Minneapolis Foundation got about $16 million from DEED. I know that they're strategically positioned to get some more money, and that's to deal with the West Broadway corridor. But guess what? Look how far removed from George Floyd we are, and that our businesses are still struggling, and they were struggling even before George Floyd.
Yep.
So I'm hopeful. I hope that something happens. We can, look, and guess what? And we can ask questions, because maybe that's what we should be asking too. Al, maybe that's a good topic for you. Call the Minneapolis Foundation and say, hey, tell us what it is that you're doing. Tell us what you've been doing in order to help since George Floyd. Tell us how you've measured that.
Consider it done. I'll make the call today. I think you're exactly right. And I'll ask them exactly the way you've asked me to ask them. I'll do that.
Yeah, because I think the way you do it is, this is where we need media also, right? Our reporters to ask the critical questions and get them on the record, right? And then you can go back and say, hey, here's what you told us.
Yep.
Tell us what you've done. Because when we don't ask them those questions in public, and we don't ask the real probing questions, then we give them what? A way out, because they don't have to come back and say anything to us, and they can continue to be in the ivory tower, and we can continue to want things, and then nothing ever happens.
And they say the same thing generation after generation after generation, new player after new player after new player, same story. Bobby, before I ask you to talk about where we are at the legislature, what deliverables have been made, I want to share with you a book that I share with people a lot. The book is called Whiteness in Plain View, and it's by Chad Montree. It's published here in Minnesota by the Minnesota Historical Press. And the author is a professor in the history department at the University of Massachusetts, Lowell. And I'll just read one paragraph because it's about what you and I are talking about, but from the lens of a white researcher and author. Whiteness in Plain View examines the ways white residents across Minnesota acted to intimidate, control, remove, and keep out African Americans over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries. Their methods ranged from anonymous threats, vandalism, and mob violence to restrictive housing covenants.
I'll just get ready to say
it. And mortgage discrimination. And they were aided by local, state, and federal government agencies, as well as openly complicit public officials. What they did was not an anomaly or an aberration in some particular place or passing moment, but rather common and continuous. So that's the story right there. This is
let me say this.
Not new. And
listen,
Go ahead.
No, it's nothing new, and that's perfect. That's why you should also bring on your show Myron. What's Myron's last name? The
Orfield.
professor
Orfield.
Orfield. That's
Yeah.
right. He's working with the black churches, talking about the very thing around housing that you heard me sort of talking a little bit about. Because when I was talking to him about it, he says, "Hey, I'm doing something on that," and with Babbington and those guys, you should certainly get him on to talk about that, right?
I will do it. He's been
And
on before, but he's always excellent. And
ask him specifically around this conversation
mhm,
around housing
mhm.
and what is going on, right? The restrictive covenants. Former Senator Jeff Hayden had a bill to remove restrictive covenants, even the language from titles, because restrictive covenants have been used and were used in order to displace, marginalize, and keep us in certain places, even in the state of Minnesota, like where
Mhm.
you could live, right? Um, and I was on a CLE, by the way. I'm listening to a CLE while I'm doing this interview, so I got two devices going on at one time.
Sure.
But I did one on housing, and a person said, another lawyer said, "Hey, since you and us as lawyers participated in the marginalization of where black folks could live with these restrictive covenants and other laws, then it's you as lawyers that should be actively engaged to change it."
Yep.
And I think that's true. We do have to change it. Okay, so you asked for a quick update on what's going
Yeah.
on at the legislature.
$9 billion.
$9 billion.
What's $9 billion story for our community?
Okay, here it is right here. Nothing.
Mm.
Nothing was passed other than unemployment insurance, 2.73 billion. That was early on, and $1 billion for reinsurance. But let me tell you, and then frontline workers, right? Because that was also with the frontline workers thing, right? But there was a fix that needed to happen with the frontline worker legislation to include child care providers, because they were frontline workers. And remember, when the essential workers had to go to work, they ordered the daycare workers to also go to work in order to make sure that the kids of the frontline workers had some place to go.
Right.
But we ended the session on May 23rd. Nothing, listen to me, nothing was passed. Not a tax bill, not bonding, not education, not housing, not public safety. Not we did have a mental health bill that I think that should get passed, but that's more policy. No money included in there. Higher ed, nothing for jobs and economic development that was passed. No agriculture that was passed, because they could not reach agreement on these important notions. So nothing. When I say nothing, nothing passed outside of the three things that I told you about. Nothing that's meaningful in order to make sure that our quality of life is addressed. Nothing that will make true investment from over $9 billion in a surplus. It is now there. Now, does that mean that we're going to have a special session? The governor originally said no. There is a possibility that a special session could be called, but only after there's an agreement on all these issues that we talked about, and then we'll be able to come back and talk about what is in those bills or what has been decided. So at the top of this program, Al, you would have had a very short discussion with me if you just asked me what happened in the legislature, because I just did that in like 30 seconds.
That's right.
Nothing.
That's right. That's right. And that's a doggone shame, you know.
It's a shame.
And so what do we do in community, Senator Champion, to, number one, continue to understand better our interests and our needs, legislation that supports our view of what community building looks like and who the community builders are that we are advancing and supporting? What do we do at this moment to ensure that if and as things wrangle themselves out, we're not wrung out of the process, pushed to the side, once again, squeezed out?
So number one is, I think those who are already elected, I think it's always important to engage them, ask us questions. Don't come saying we haven't done anything, right? Ask us the question, because some of us are over there fighting, but you don't always see what happens, because there's 201 legislators and there's a process in which to get these things through. But we also have people who live not just in the urban corridors, and not just in North Loop or North Minneapolis or Bryn Mawr and other places that I represent. Some people that we know, some of our friends live in the suburbs. Mm-hmm. They too should be calling their representatives, regardless of what party that they're affiliated with, and say, hey, what are you doing for us? Tell me what you're doing in these areas, because whether we believe it or not, the notion of community must be enlarged as well, because the disinvestment that happens in our community means it also happens in the suburbs too. And do you not realize that we have more in common with the rural community than either one knows? They let the elites and others who want to retain power make us fight each other to talk about the rural and urban divide, when if we were to unify, man, we have the same issues around unemployment, healthcare, access to broadband, housing. I can go through it.
Yeah. Opioid abuse, substance abuse,
Substance
health.
abuse, health. So if you allow people to create a narrative that you just grab a hold to without fully understanding it, then you will be a part of a conversation where most people are just talking about police, but not talking about public safety comprehensively. Right? You know, how do we deal with our juveniles? How do we deal with those other things? So getting involved, knowing what's going on, asking us questions, even with your sororities and fraternities. You know, I be getting a lot of engagement from the AKAs and Deltas, who are now getting a little more engaged, but I don't hear much from Alphas. I don't hear much from the Qs. I don't hear much from all the others who could have some political power because they have numbers.
Well, you heard me shouting them out right now. So
if you don't know, that's okay. That's why we have the engagement, and we can talk, so we can figure it out, and people can talk about what their interests are and what is or is not happening, and then they can find a space where they want to engage, because they don't have to do everything. Sometimes it's just being in your lane, the place where you have the most capacity. Just speak to that question, and that will be helpful, because then you might get on a commission. You might get on a task force, or the information you share may be a part of the policy that we are wrestling with in real time.
Let me finish the last 2 minutes here, Senator Champion, talking about COVID-19, Omicron. There's a sense that COVID is over, but I think that wisdom says it's not over. And even if it is declining in the larger community, our community is still under siege. There's still a crisis in the Black community, but some of us are not acting like that, or we are wistfully thinking that we can crowd into the bars and the nightclubs like we see white people doing, but the consequence may be different because we haven't fully vaccinated, et cetera. What are your, first of all, thanks for what you have done in leading the utilization of assets in the community to be part of educating our community about prevention, about mitigation, and about vaccine and protocols that help reduce some of the impact of COVID-19 in our community. But as we see the resurgence, what are you saying? What are you inviting? And will we see the state continue to invest aggressively or expand its investment in Black media, Inside News and others, to help bring messages about COVID-19 prevention to our Black community?
Well, thank you for that. I remember as I put that group together, it was a cross section of both from the great group and coalition that you have that is also includes Latinos, Somalis, on and on and on, right? The full spectrum and breadth of who we are, right? And using that vehicle in our various communities. And I fought for that because it's necessary, and I'm going to continue to fight for that. So I'm asking them to not just do what they've done, but do more, and then do more not just with the pandemic in mind, but more when it comes to engagement with MnDOT or engagement in other places or spaces, right? How do we make sure that we use this tool that we have, in a real way? So we're going to continue to do more. We're going to ask the state and continue to ask the governor to do more, who's been really a great partner with us. And so I think that's important. Lastly, the pandemic has not gone anywhere. We had so many people who came down with COVID in the legislature, and we as people of color are more at risk because we have more of the frontline jobs. Do you not know we as lawyers can sit at home and do Zoom hearings? We don't even have to go out of the house, except in some crazy communities where they still want us no matter what. I think that we still can do some in-person, especially if it's evidentiary, because then you control who comes in and who doesn't. But when it comes to a 5-minute hearing that is going to take 5 minutes, why don't you use this vehicle in order for us to remain safe? So we as communities, we usually are doing those frontline jobs that require a lot of interaction with a cross-section of people, and we have to be mindful. And I remind people to be vaccinated because by all accounts, the pandemic is still here, but the symptoms are less when you're fully vaccinated and boosted. And so shout out to StairStep and all their great work with the Minnesota Department of Health as well.
Senator Champion, we're out of time. This has been a wonderful, wonderful conversation. It goes so quickly. Thank you so much. Please come back again and again and again. Our microphone's open for you and your colleagues. We'll see you next time.
Thank you. See you next time. And thank you for all your hard work. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye. And now we go back to our station, KFAI. I'm Al McFarlane. This is Conversations with Al McFarlane. We'll see you next week.
And thank you, Al McFarlane, for conversations that matter to communities that matter, both locally and globally. You are listening to Fresh Air Community Radio. We are KFAI at 90.3 FM in Minneapolis, and online you can find us at www.kfai.org radio, without boundaries.
Programming on KFAI is supported in part by Metro Transit, offering careers, not just jobs, full-time